Hi, I'm David Zyla, and I'd like to welcome you to today's NAC Home at Home program. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club hosts more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Following the conversation today will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the chat or Q&A function to ask any questions that you may have. So I'm very excited to have with us today Erika Holst, and let me tell you a little bit about her. She is the Curator of History at the Illinois State Museum. Her most recent exhibition, currently on view, is Fashioning Illinois, 1820 to 1900, a collection of 19th century clothing worn by Illinois women. Holst has worked in the public history field for more than 15 years, during which time she has curated more than a dozen exhibitions. Her 2013 exhibition, Hidden in Plain Sight, The Material World of Early Springfield, won the Illinois State Historical Society's Award for Superior Achievement. Before joining the Illinois State Museum, Erika served as Curator of Collections at the historic Edwards Place in Springfield, Illinois. Her publications include Wicked Springfield Crime, Corruption, and Scandal during the Lincoln Era, Edwards Place, A Springfield Treasure, and Historic Houses of Lincoln's, Illinois, as well as several articles. Holst holds a master's degree from the Winter program in early American culture. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Erika Holst. Welcome, Erika.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited to talk about this topic, which is near and dear to my heart and that I hope everyone enjoys hearing about. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Away we go. So this program is going to discuss 19th century undergarments. And so it is based on the work I did for an exhibit that's currently on view called Fashioning Illinois 1820 to 1900. It's closing at our flagship facility in Springfield, Illinois, but it is moving to our suburban Chicago facility in Lockport. It will open there in August and run through January. So if anyone happens to be in the Chicago area, we would love it if you would come pay us a visit. So let's be real. If you've ever seen a photo of someone from the 19th century, you've wondered what's underneath, right? Like, how does that silhouette happen? What is going on to support all that fabric and give that bell-shaped skirt look? And that's what we're going to dive into, as well as all the social and cultural implications of what women's undergarments and what women's silhouette meant about their roles in society. So just to kind of, get things going, I wonder if you could pause and just think a little bit about what comes to mind when you think of 19th century undergarments. What's a word that comes to mind? Is it constricting? Is it uncomfortable? Is it freeing? Is it beautiful? And I'm seeing a lot of all that: full, hoop, constricting, cotton, tight. All of that, yes. So we'll dive in because it is very complicated and it meant different things to different people. So moving along, here's some basics about underwear. And the key thing to know is what Eliza Farrar told us in The Young Lady's Friend, published in 1849. She said, as a general rule, those things that are injured by washing should never be worn next to the skin. So we have to think about the realities of life in the 19th century to understand where they're coming from in terms of their layers. They don't have washing machines. They don't have indoor plumbing. Their washing process consists of scrubbing their laundry in a bin on a washboard. And your nice dresses, your silk dresses, your dyed dresses aren't going to withstand that kind of abuse from washing. So your undergarments are the things that are worn close to the body. They're going to protect your outer garments from the sweat and oils and grime coming off your body. They're also going to protect your body from the hardware of the corset, the maybe potential scratchiness of the inside. So think of it kind of like as a buffer layer, undergarments between your body and your outer clothing. Underpinnings, is another word for undergarments, are generally made from cotton or linen during the 19th century. It tends to be linen earlier in the century, and then linen becomes a little bit more elite later on. Linen is durable, it's breathable, it's absorbent, it's easy to clean, and it has this wonderful property of growing softer with wear. And I was just in our collection of clothing with a researcher, and we pulled out a 19th century man's shirt made of linen, and it was like watered silk. It was so soft and beautiful. Cotton becomes more available as the cotton economy takes off in the 19th century. It's cheaper, it's a little less durable, and requires a little more frequent washing to keep clean. And undergarments are generally, until the very end of the 19th century, white or what's called blonde, which is sort of a buff color. And just like having white children's clothing, having white underwear may not seem like it makes sense, but it actually made the most sense, because your undergarments are the things that are going to be washed frequently in hot, sudsy water. And so an undyed fabric is going to be the thing that's going to be able to withstand that really frequent washing that was necessary to keep it fresh. So we're going to dive in first from the point of the 1860s, because in terms of underpinnings, this is an interesting time. It's right about mid-century, and this is the peak of the hoop skirt, which a lot of people are kind of interested in to begin with. So what kind of layers are necessary to achieve this bell-shaped silhouette in the 1860s? First of all, we're going to start with the chemise. So pretend we are, getting dressed. We're a 19th century woman in front of our wardrobe. We are standing in our birthday suit, and we're putting on one layer at a time. Number one is the chemise, which is going to be made of linen or cotton. And this is the thing that's worn closest to the skin to absorb dirt and sweat. This is the 19th century equivalent of underpants, except for obviously it's long like a nightgown. And this is the thing that's going to protect the body from the corset. So I'm going to share with you something that grinds my gears a little bit. And if we have any historical interpreters, probably it irritates them too. Whenever I see something like this is just know, you don't wear a corset next to your body. You can't clean a corset as easily, so it's going to make your corset all grimy. It's also going to chafe really badly. So anytime you see this, know that someone is not on top of their 19th century underpinnings. Next come drawers, and this is by the 1860s, they're fairly common. Drawers are kind of a new innovation that come in the 1820s and 30s, and it starts with the urban middle classes and upper classes, and the fashion kind of works its way down the economic scale. So drawers are called drawers because you literally draw them on one leg at a time. They generally tie around the waist. Often they have a drawstring to get the fit right. And they're often split, especially earlier in the century. And this is for the simple reason that makes it easier to use the restroom. And this is the example of drawers we have on view at the Illinois State Museum. And it's one of my favorite items of historical clothing because it's got this really personal little quirk in it. So I'm going to show you an image of the waistband here. It's got the laundry mark of its original owner, Carolyn A. Sutherland. And she's got it stamped in her laundry. And this was a common practice with undergarments. Just like taking a Sharpie and writing your kid's name in their underpants when you send them to summer camp, it's the same exact principle. You want to make sure that the right person's undergarments stay with the right person. If you imagine a family's household laundry going into one common boiling pot, and there might be 6 daughters in the family, and each of them are washing 3 sets of drawers, you can see what a challenge it might be to redistribute things afterwards. So Carolyn had this laundry mark in her drawers. She was married in 1854, became a mother the following year, and sadly died in childbirth. So by July of 1855, she has passed away. Her drawers were apparently appropriated by her sister-in-law, Mary Hoag Sutherland, who crossed out Carolyn's initials and wrote in her own. So basically we have a sister-in-law appropriating her deceased sister's drawers for her own, which to our modern mind feels a little boundary pushing, that someone would appropriate such an intimate item of clothing. Looking at it from the perspective of the 19th century, women's undergarments tended to be handmade by them. You might go to a dressmaker for a more complicated fit, such as an outer garment, but most women possess sewing skills, and most women generally use them for domestic textiles, for their children's clothes, and for their own undergarments. So Mary Sutherland probably saw this pair of drawers left behind by Carolyn and thought, that's about 10 hours of my life there. If I just, take those and make a simple stroke of a pen, then it saves me a lot of sewing. Moving on to stockings. Stockings are long knitted or sewn hosiery that reached above the knee, not to be confused with socks, which are shorter. Stockings are commercially available. The Industrial Revolution has hit England in the 1800s. There are socks being mass produced in factories. However, people are still knitting their own socks. So it really depends. And there's a wide range. You could have a, pair of fairly thick cotton stockings. You could have an extremely fine pair of knitted silk stockings, kind of different for different occasions. Stockings are some of my favorite things in the collection because I love to see the evidence of use in them. Oftentimes you'll see darning in the toes and the heels, and this tells us that these are things that were worn, time was invested in them, they weren't just tossed when they became damaged, people took the time to sit and mend them and keep them in rotation. And because they're going up above the knee or just under the knee, oftentimes they're tied up with ribbon or knitted garters to keep them in place. Okay, fourth layer shoes asterisk. There's a little bit of debate about this. Some people believe that shoes went on now prior to the corset because it was easier to bend over and get your shoes on before you've got something restricting around your midsection. Others argue, and this image from about the year 1900 seems to argue that no, that people had no problems touching their toes, that corsets really weren't all that restrictive. So I'm not going to wade in and take a side on that. We'll leave the shoes right here in the presentation, but suffice to say they could have easily have been put on at the end of one's dressing experience as well. And now it's time for the corset. And so the number 1 and 2 functions of a corset are to provide a smooth foundation for the outer garments and to support the back and breasts of the wearer. If you look at photos of women in 19th century garments, you'll see often the top fits very precisely. And we need to remember that in the 19th century, all clothing for women until the very end of the century is generally bespoke, which means clothing is made for somebody. It's made for somebody's particular dimensions and people's own anatomical quirks. And as a curator, this was the biggest challenge to staging a historic costume exhibit because we need to get mannequins that will fit garments, and each garment is completely unique to the woman who wore it. So I spent a lot of time with an electric knife shaving down mannequins to get the right size and then building them back up with polyester batting and stockinette to get the precise dimensions. But that's all possible with the corset, and your clothing is sewn to your proportions. So, if you've got a dress that's sewn with a 22-inch waist and, you've put on some pounds lately and you can't get your waist down to 22 inches, then you've got some alterations to do because your dress just isn't going to fit anymore. I'm going to pause and do a little bit of a deeper dive about the corset because it's such a, fraught item, probably the most fraught item of women's clothing from the 19th century. And there are so many myths surrounding it, and there are so many different perspectives. One of the most common is that, this is a torture device, and women tight-laced themselves to the point where, they fainted, they damaged their internal organs. The reality is that most women did not tight lace, which is, constrict their waist to a really unhealthy degree. Certainly, there probably were young women who did that. Just like in any time and in any place, there are people who go to the extremes for fashion. Most women wore a corset, as I said, to create that smooth foundation, to support their back and breasts, and it reduced the size of the waist by an average of 2 inches and sort of transformed the shape of a woman's waist, which is naturally sort of elliptical, to kind of a more rounded. So behind the idea of the corset is, what did it mean? Is this an instrument of the patriarchy meant to torture women? Is this a status symbol or a beauty symbol that made women feel attractive and look attractive? And the answer to all of this is probably yes. It's such a complicated garment. Yes, there are probably elements of patriarchy and control in it. And there are some scholars who argue that as women gained more freedom in American society, fashion sort of responded by becoming more constrictive, as almost like a ploy to keep women in their place. There are also people who argue that corsets are symbols of beauty and attractiveness, and that women enjoyed the look that they gave as something that enhanced their figure. There's interesting research on the idea that when corsets went by the wayside in the 1920s, women responded by self-corseting, like the impulse to diet, to exercise, to sculpt your body into something that's considered attractive, takes over from the point where the physical corset drops off, which makes sense to me. And I think I'd rather take a corset because I'm terrible at the diet and exercise part. So food for thought. Corsets were designed to create an hourglass figure. It sort of redistributes mass up to the bust area and down to the hips area. If you think about the silhouette, it's the silhouette of a young woman, and it's completely antithetical to the silhouette of a mother or a pregnant woman. So interesting to unpack what that means about motherhood and sensuality and motherhood and sexuality, where a feminine rounded ideal is not considered one that's sensual. It's also an aspirational item. It's something that women from most classes could afford, although it's also a symbol of status because it's meant to denote middle-class respectability. In fact, women who did not wear corsets, and there were many, immigrant women, enslaved women, some older women, if you weren't in a corset, you were considered there's the impulse to call you a loose woman. Loose meaning not in a corset, loose also meaning, loose promiscuousness. So there's this cultural impulse to bind women into corsets, establish this as an ideal, and then for women who are barred or denied entry into this ideal to judge them for it, which is sort of harsh. On the other end of the spectrum, many women probably enjoyed the support that it wore. Really, it's kind of the modern equivalent of a bra, there is an element of support, and maybe they liked the way that it made them feel. So I know there are probably some historical reenactors in the group, and I would be interested to hear at the end of the talk what your impressions of wearing a corset are. So getting ourselves back on track, the next element is the under petticoat. This is what you wear under your hoop, and it keeps you covered in case your skirt should flip up in a breeze. Often these could be quilted or made of flannel for warmth in the winter. And now the hoop. The hoop extends skirts without having to wear a lot of layers of petticoats. So you look at this thing and it looks a little torturous, that women are walking around in a cage. Actually, it was considered an innovation that most women embraced because The bell-shaped silhouette did not originate with the hoop. The hoop facilitated an already existing bell-shaped silhouette. So prior to this, you would achieve that bell-shaped silhouette by wearing lots of petticoats, by wearing stiffened petticoats, starched or horsehair petticoats or corded petticoats. But this hoop let you expand the diameter and circumference of your skirt without adding on another layer or 2 or 10. They're not often worn while working. That's an asterisk too. I'll show you a cartoon on the next side here. Excuse me. So on the left, we have this newspaper cartoon from the 1860s who loved to poke fun of their domestic servants. It was kind of a middle-class pastime. So here we have the lady of the house talking to her domestic servant and kind of chiding her for wearing a hoop and saying, "Don't you know how ridiculous you look?" And kind of the joke is that the mistress of the house, leaning forward with her ankles showing and her drawers showing, probably looks equally ridiculous. She's being a little hypocritical there. We also have real-life images of the Lowell mill girls, and these are also from the 1860s. You see that they're not wearing hoops. It would have been a danger to women doing factory work where their extended skirts could be caught up in machinery. So as a rule, if you are a woman who has got up and you are not expecting company that very moment, if you're not leaving the house, you're not going to put on a hoop first thing. In fact, women had garments called wrappers that they would wear around the house. Some could accommodate a hoop, many didn't. If you're scrubbing the floors that day or doing the laundry, a hoop isn't part of your ensemble. There are pros and cons to the hoop, and as we talked about, some of the pros include the fact that it could be lighter, cooler. These can also be mass-produced, so they're pretty affordable. They could be hazardous to your health. There are newspaper accounts of carriage accidents where hoops got caught in the wheels of the carriage. We've got this little snippet of a piece from a London newspaper, and it talks about 19 females who were burned by their clothes taking fire so as to cause their death. Women spend a lot of time around open fireplaces and hot stoves, and so wearing a lot of fabric around you was definitely a health hazard. Next, the over petticoat, and the job of the over petticoat is to smooth out the shape of the skirt and hide the lines of the hoop. And sometimes you will see 19th century photographs where you can plainly see the line of that hoop poking through the skirt, and that's kind of a faux pas. That wasn't supposed to be the look. It was supposed to be just this sort of smooth bell shape, and that's what the over petticoat was for. So stopping to look right now, this is where we're at so far. We have numerous layers on. Now we're about to put a couple finishing touches on and dive on to the outer garments. So next we're going to talk about the pocket, collar, and cuffs. And a pocket is sort of an older convention. It phases out by about the mid-19th century, but it's literally what it sounds like. If your dress does not have a pocket, you would tie on a pocket around your waist. It has a slit in the front. Your dress would have a slit in the front, so you could just stick your hand through that slit and carry your small items underneath your dress. Pockets are not as uncommon as you might think. In examining the clothing from our collection, I've seen many, many pockets sewn into the seams of dresses. And my favorite thing is sometimes you will stick your hand in the pocket of a 19th century garment and the lady's handkerchief will still be there, which is just this wonderful connection to the past, having been left over all this time. Next is collars and cuffs. And if you look closely at a 19th century photograph, we'll look at one again, you'll start to notice that everyone has a bit of lace at their wrists and around their neck. And this serves a dual function. It's an ornamental and decorative touch, but it also has a very practical component because your neck area and your sleeve area are parts of the body that are going to get grimiest fastest. And so the collar and cuffs are basted onto the garment. They're going to absorb that sweat and dirt and grime. And when they get all grimy, you snip them off, throw them in the wash, and baste on a fresh set. So again, this is saving your outer garment from needing spot cleaning or needing laundering. Now we're ready for the dress. After all that, we're 11 layers in and finally putting on the garment. The bodice and skirt could be separate pieces or the dress could be one piece. It just kind of depended. Up through the 1840s, they generally closed in the back. By about the middle of the 1850s, you start to see front fastening garments, which continues on through the rest of the century. What we're looking at here is a walking dress. Etiquette manuals advised women who were going out and walking on the street or traveling to wear muted colors because it was considered gauche to wear bright, vibrant colors that would draw attention to yourself in public. Finishing touches. Etiquette required wearing a bonnet and gloves while going outside. And actually, specifically, etiquette said that when you stepped out the house, you had to have your bonnet tied and your gloves on. It was also considered a faux pas if you're strolling down the street, buttoning up your gloves. And then jewelry added a little bit of a refined touch. Common items of jewelry included earrings, a pocket watch, a necklace, a brooch. What we see often in our collection of historic clothing, at the neck of garments, you'll see all these tiny little pinholes where the original owner has pinned a brooch and pinned a brooch and pinned a brooch over and over and over again, which I also find delightful. And so now let's look at the finished product one more time. And now we can kind of see everything that's going on here. We can see that this woman is wearing a corset and that her top of her dress is very fitted to the shape of her body. She's got a nice smooth fit. She has an hoop on that's extending her skirt, and she's probably also wearing an over petticoat because we cannot see the telltale line of the hoop poking through. You can see that she's got the collar at her neck and the cuffs at her sleeves. You can also see her pocket watch tucked into her waistband there. So she's got all the finishing touches to kind of complete the sartorial ideal of the 1860s. So I'm going to stop here and take a moment to reflect on what makes you, what do you have to be wearing to feel fully put together? We just saw that the lady of the 19th century was wearing around a dozen or so layers, give or take, to feel kind of put together and ready to leave the house. And what does that look like today? And what does that look like today versus you know, say a year and a half ago, pre-pandemic? You know, for me, after pandemic, the bar is so low. You know, if I'm wearing pants, I consider it a victory. But I know from my mother's generation, you know, my mother was a, you know, stockings that matched her pumps, that matched her purse, and she was very made up and accessorized, and that didn't translate to me. And it's probably part generational and probably part, you know, contrariness on my part. So I'm going to take a peek at the chat to see if anyone. Never feel dressed if I forget my earrings. A bra when leaving the house. That's a baseline too, yeah. Earrings. Socks. Yeah, it's an evolution, and I was just in a meeting at work where they talked about an update to the employee code, and the professional dress code is probably going away. You know, it's something that's been on the wane for the past 20 years, and the idea of kind of a business look, at least as far as our agency in the state of Illinois, has kind of, you know, it's now up to an individual's discretion to dress for the occasion that they're going to be showing up for. Okay, now we're going to take a turn and look at underpinnings through the 1800s and see how silhouettes evolved, what they signified and what they were responding to, and what kind of undergarment engineering was necessary to make that happen. So we'll start with the early 1800s and 1810s. And this look is the Empire waist for all fans of Jane Austen. This is your classic kind of Regency look. The really high waist here, sort of just a columnar sheath of muslin or cotton. It was a very simple era. This is a fashion that harkens back to ancient Greece and Rome that was very popular in the early years of the American Republic because America fancied itself a young republic or a young democracy that was an extension of those early democratic and republican ideals. In terms of what it took to support this look, not a whole lot. Women wore corsets. They were kind of, sort of straight up and down. You might wear a chemise or a petticoat, but that's about it. And so this little fashion cartoon here really kind of illustrates how free women had it. There's not that ideal of, a cinched in waist or the hourglass figure. This is probably about as free as women are going to have things for the next 100 years. For the next several decades, the undergarments get more complicated and more constricting. And this begins in the 1820s and 1830s when the Regency Empire waist style phases out. The waist gradually drops down and the skirt gradually expands, and we're in what's known as the Romantic era. And this is an era in which women's roles are idealized as morally pure and domestic and home-centered and sort of ornamental. And so this hourglass figure comes into play. We talked about tight lacing, and the shape of these garments sort of illustrates why tight lacing wasn't absolutely necessary, because the poofiness on your shoulders and the poofiness of a skirt creates an optical illusion that really naturally whittles your waist without actually having to physically constrict it to a small dimension. We're also looking here at the reflections of a lot of industrial and economic changes that have many layers of meanings for consumers as well as producers. So what you're going to see for the next several decades are women's fashions that create or use yards and yards and yards of fabric. The garment on the left there is a roller printed cotton dress. This isn't possible unless there is an industry that's producing textiles at mass quantities. And so, of course, this lovely cotton dress here is directly tied to millions of enslaved Americans kept in bondage whose labor and lives are stolen from them. This dress, this fashion, all the yardage just isn't possible unless fabric is available cheaply, and that fabric isn't available cheaply without the stolen labor of those who are producing it. We're also seeing the effects of industrialization on the textile industry. There are mills established in England and popping up in the United States, particularly in the North, which have complicated meanings for the female workers. In some cases, they provide economic opportunities to rural women who might not have otherwise had them. By the same token, there's exploitative labor practices going on, unsafe conditions, long hours, low wages here that are also kind of baked into it. So we're starting to see these national and even global economic systems in which, the cheap availability of goods and textiles is offset by there are people paying a very real cost in terms of exploitation and suffering for it. And this actually continues today. I wish there was a happy ending to that story, but the fast fashion industry practices of today, the labor has shifted overseas, but the exploitation continues. So in the 1820s and 30s, kind of the salient part of that, the big poofy sleeves that will make their reappearance at the end of the century. And those are supported by these arm plumpers that are filled with down and or cotton. And they really just serve to, increase the shape of that sleeve to give it a puffy look. They were called leg of mutton sleeves because they resembled literally, giant legs of mutton on your shoulders. We're moving into the 1840s. The bell-shaped skirt continues to grow, which requires many petticoats to make it happen. The look of the torso is very long, kind of cone-shaped, very narrow. Armholes tend to be very high, and sleeves, especially in the 1840s, tend to be tight. So some scholars have connected the idea of women's elevated role in society, this moral purity, but their constricted status. We're at the heart of the ideology of domesticity now, where the ideal placed on women is for them to be mothers and homemakers. And of course, I want to say we're talking in ideals here, and women's lives then as in now are so complicated, and a woman might be many different things at many points of her life, and her fashion choices and clothing options would have reflected that. You know, a woman who is a girl and then a teenager and then a bride and then a mother and then a widow and then an older woman, and perhaps she's working at some point and not working. You know, all these different life stages, life choices, life conditions will influence what women are wearing. So what we're looking at here is sort of the kind of middle of the road cultural ideal, you know, dress for going to church or out in public, but it's in no way meant to be representative of the fullness of women's experience. So in the 1840s and 50s, to get that support for these skirts, you could wear many, many petticoats. Some innovations that predated the hoop are on the left. This is a crinoline from the French for horsehair. It's literally a horsehair stiffened fabric that gives you some of that extra volume. Or on the right, a corded petticoat, which has cotton cording sewn into it, will also kind of give you more volume without having to wear quite as many layers. And we're going to skip over the 1860s because we did such a deep dive on them earlier, and move ahead to the 1870s and 1880s. So now we're post-Civil War in America, and fashion has taken a dramatic shift. The big hoop skirts of the 1850s and 60s have given way to the bustle era. So if you can picture a bustle as kind of in general being all the fabric, you know, that used to be a big circumference here, kind of gathered up and moved towards the back. And it needed support underneath, so women would often wear these cages, or sometimes they're called lobster tails, that like really literally exist to poof out a woman's backside. Some people have pointed out the connection between the arrival of the bustle in American culture and increasing urbanization, and suggested that a bustle is more conducive to walking down a crowded city street where you're not, you know, taking up 6 feet of space around you. You're able to be a little bit more forward moving and presumably faster. So the interesting underpinnings from this decade to fashion on are the wide array of cages and lobster tails and bustle pads that help to accentuate that rear-facing shape. This is also a time of increasing industrialization in the United States, rising disposable incomes, improving transportation networks, and part of what that comes together for is the magic of all different kinds of devices to increase the volume of a woman's derriere. So all these are different products that were on the market that you could eventually order from Montgomery Ward or Sears and Roebuck to show up on your door and have you be in keeping with the fashions of the day. And I also want to back up for just a second and point out how elaborate the fashions gotten. The 1870s and 1880s are a time of a lot of trim, a lot of ruffles, very elaborate buttons. And so this coincides with the arrival of the home sewing machine on the scene, which was marketed to women as the idea that this is a labor-saving device. If Mary Hogue had had a home sewing machine, maybe she wouldn't have felt the need to steal her sister-in-law's drawers because she could have whipped out a pair of her own in an hour and a half. But kind of counterbalancing that is this increasing impulse to embellished clothing. The idea being like, now that you're saving all this time with construction, you have time to add ruffles and bows and ruching and this and that. So any time saved on the machine was actually lost to the increasingly complex nature of women's fashion. 1890s are in some ways a revival of the look of the 1820s and 30s. We're back to these big poofy sleeves and an A-line skirt. In general, women's clothing is becoming a little bit easier to wear at this point. It's not exactly reflected in the garment I've chosen to show you, but there's a new cultural ideal that replaced the romantic ideal of the domestic woman, and it was kind of dubbed the new woman. So there's this cultural ideal of a woman who's a little bit more robust, and she is active, and she might ride a bicycle, or she might go hiking, but she's sort of youthful and vigorous. And so the fashion is gradually starting to reflect this. We get bloomers coming onto the scene that are socially acceptable for women to ride bicycles in. We just have kind of a little bit more of an ease of dressing. We also have the introduction of separates. You've got the shirtwaist blouse and the separate skirt that are a lot easier to care for and to put on. Of course, the flip side of that is the irony that the liberation of the shirtwaist in terms of dressing and in terms of being something that working women wear as they leave the home for professional opportunities and offices. Those same shirtwaists are made in factories by women whose labor is exploited to make them, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company being probably the most famous example. So in the 1890s, we again have innovations. Finally, we've got some color coming into underwear. The nature of dyes have improved to make them more color fast, and the nature of laundry has improved to where it's not so hard on things. So you get these wonderful colored corsets, brightly colored petticoats and stockings and things like that. We've got a variation on the arm plumper, the shoulder thing that comes back. And in terms of underpinnings, you see the introduction of the garment on the right, which is called a combination, which is literally sort of a chemise and drawers all kind of put into one union suit there. And then finally, the 1900s, we have this sort of, it's one of the more bizarre silhouettes that women have endured in history, and it's called the S-curve or the powder pigeon or the mono bosom. And the idea is of the bust kind of, if you picture the top of an S, the bust is here, the waist is about the midpoint, and then curving around to the S is the back side of the skirt. And this is part of that argument that at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, when women are achieving more freedoms, they're advocating for suffrage, they're leaving the home to work, fashion kind of became more restrictive and put them into this weird shaped silhouette as kind of like a slap back at them. So if you look how this works, the corsets at that time were engineered in a way that kind of like sort of tries to force women into this strange silhouette. This lasted through the 1900s. By the 1910s, the silhouette was more up and down. And then, of course, by the 1920s, the whole corset Victorian look is sort of gone for good. So one more question for reflection here. What innovation in clothing / underwear are you most grateful for? And for me, gosh, I don't know. I guess it would be stretchy fabric. Anything stretchy, leggings, the stretch that goes into jeans, bras, pantyhose, separates, elastic. I hear that. And we've reached the end of my talk. I'm ready to take questions. Again, I just want to give you my contact information here. If you have any questions that I'm not able to address in the chat portion of our afternoon together, please do email me. I'd be happy to address them directly. And also want to let you know that we do have a lovely lookbook of the exhibit that we sell in our museum shop. So there's the web address if you want to pick it up and see some of the garments closer and in lovely living color. So thank you so much. And yes, please share your questions with me.
Erika, thank you so much for such an incredible presentation. I think we all learned so much, and I can see from the chat box how many questions are coming in. And please keep them in. We'll get them. We'll get to questions in just a moment. I have a question for you, and that is, what originally piqued your interest in this subject matter?
Well, first of all, the Illinois State Museum has a fantastic collection of 19th century clothing that had never before been displayed. So I had this desire to just get these wonderful things out in front of the public. And beyond that, I find clothing so deeply personal because, as we talked about, it's, custom made. So it's almost like the silhouettes of the people at Pompeii. There was a person standing there who fit this exact silhouette, and their sweat was in this garment. It's just so personal and so evocative of people who are no longer with us, that kind of moves me.
And I'm curious. So your research is fantastic, and I love the sister-in-law swiping the drawers. That's wonderful and fascinating, and such a wonderful touchstone of that period of how life was and so on. And I'm curious, in all of this research that you did, what would you deem was the most unexpected bit of research that you discovered, or what surprised you the most?
What surprised me the most was kind of the complex web that undergirds fashion. I went into it because I like the pretty clothes and I wanted to put pretty things out on display. It was the digging into the discussion of how they're made and where the materials are sourced, that really, like I talked about with the 1820s slide, the dress is in some ways the tip of the iceberg. And, there's opportunities for women who are dressmakers, or in some cases factory workers, but there's also exploitation and human suffering, and it's all bound up. And, in many ways, it's the same today. We are a society of consumers, and we don't always know where our products come from or the conditions that produce them. And we have the same sort of moral ambiguity of, I'm benefiting, I'm supporting this, I'm a piece in this puzzle that has many shades of gray in it. So I guess the fact that it's a lot more complicated than just pretty dresses.
Wonderful. So we're going to go to some of the great questions, and these are really wonderful questions. I am going to start with Cynthia asks, when did split drawers become panties as we know?
So they kind of evolved from split drawers from, say, and these are just rough terms, there's an element of personal preference in there too. Say like 1820s, 30s, when they're first introduced, to 1850s, 60s, by 60s-ish, 70s-ish, the split becomes a single set of drawers. Through the third quarter of the 19th century, there's a single set of drawers, and by the end of the 19th century, we get the combination suit. And so panties as we know it probably come in around like the 1920s, but they're not like bikini briefs, they're like granny panties.
PJ asks, what was used for dyeing of undergarments?
So prior to the advent of color fast dyes in the late 19th century, they were undyed and unbleached, which made them such an attractive option. By the time the 19th century rolls around, the end of it, we have like chemical-based dyes that are more color fast than natural plant fiber-based dyes. So science and chemistry give us dyes.
Rosabelle asks, if you would talk a little bit about posture and the corset.
Yeah, so a corset forces you into a straight posture. And as I say that, I'm straightening up because I know my posture isn't great. But there's an element of presentation, and there's a neat correlation between this as well and 19th century furniture. If you look at 19th century furniture, especially parlor furniture, it's not something that you're meant to curl up and take a nap on. You know, it's almost like a set piece where you are presenting yourself and the best version of yourself. So there are chairs where you're meant to sit upright, and the corset kind of plays into that and reinforces the idea of posture and bearing and presentation, which are also tied into these, you know, middle class ideals and ideals of status. But also aspirational too, because posture is something that, you know, someone can achieve, and you can buy a corset and sit straight. So yeah.
Sharon asks, how does one sit in a hoop skirt?
It's actually easier than it looks. And if we have some interpreters on here, they can attest to that. They collapse up like an accordion. So you just kind of have to make sure that you're coming in at the right angle, and the skirts and the support will just sort of fold up. And same with that bustle too. That bustle will just collapse right up, and one can sit down.
Christine asks, these are such great questions. Keep them coming, please. She asks, what were the hoops made of?
They were made of, I've seen them made out of wire, reed, I want to say. Those are the two that come to mind. And if people know more, please do chime in. Bone, yes, thank you.
And PJ asks, in the 1870s and 1880s, did the chemise still exist?
Yes, the chemise hangs on through, and especially in the, with the shirtwaist blouse of the 1890s into the 1900s, it's very sheer, you know, so you want to have something underneath. So the chemise hangs on probably right through until about 1910, 1920.
Renee, thank you for your question. Were corsets made with whalebone?
Yes, they were. They could have steel inserts or, whalebone. And it's neat too, because I've got some archaeologist buddies, and they recover the bones from the ground. The corset will have disintegrated, but they have the, you know, whale bones and the hooks and eyes off of garments that are the only survivors.
Christy asks, where does the word shirtwaist originate?
It's literally a play off of a man's shirt. So it's kind of a nod to the fact that, you know, a shirt was a man's garment, and it looks like a man's garment. And it's something that comes increasingly into use as women are leaving the home to go work in professional or retail or, school teacher settings.
A question that came up a couple of times is if you might talk about a woman, some women obviously had help getting dressed in all of these layers. How were the garments different, or were they different for women that dressed themselves?
That's a great question. And there is actually an innovation that came in around the 1820s or 30s. It's called a split busk corset. So if you, like, prior to 1830, a corset would look like a camisole with a lace-up back. But by the 1820s or 30s, they opened at the front. And so you would have it like kind of laced, and then you could hook it up yourself, and then you reach behind and you can tighten it yourself. So after the introduction of that, a woman can get dressed by herself. It's probably easier to have an extra pair of hands around, but it's not impossible. In fact, if you don't mind, I would love to drop a link in the chat. I actually filmed a video of we filmed a video where I'm putting on all the layers so you can see how it all comes together. And I had to star in it because I couldn't ask anyone I worked with, like, hey, can we film you putting on underwear? So I took one for the team there.
Anna asks if you have a favorite decade.
I like the 1850s. I like a good bell-shaped silhouette. I like hand sewing too, more than machine sewing. So yeah, there's something romantic about all those layers and yardage.
Let's see if there are any. Would you say, Renee asks, would you say the transition between the hourglass shape and the 1920s chemise is a style from Paul Poiret?
I don't know the answer to that. That's an excellent question. If anyone else wants to jump in and ask, I would welcome other input.
And I guess there have been a couple of questions about lace. One earlier was, did the women often make the lace, or was this something that they sourced? And then there's another question that just came in from Krista asking, when did machine-made lace come to be more popular over the handmade?
Gosh, I learned that in grad school 20 years ago, and I'm going to have to reach way back into the depths of my memory. I don't know when machine-made lace came in. I do know that lace was a cottage industry, and there's a big center of it in Massachusetts as early as the 18th century, where women would make lace out of their home and sell it at the market. So women didn't need to make their individual lace. I think they could. It's sort of a genteel hobby if you have the time for it, and if you enjoy that sort of thing, certainly you could. But it was commercially available, whether it's available having been made by someone else's hand or by machine. I'm a little fuzzy on
that. Let's see what else we have. We also had a question earlier about, let's see, where did it go? Oh, we had a lot of questions on the corset, so I have one more about it. We talked about posture. Another question that came in was about corsets was lower back support, and various discussions about whether it was really uncomfortable or whether it was very comfortable. And I'm just curious, since there were so many questions about that, what your take on it is.
The terms of the comfort of the corset?
Exactly.
I think you got used to it. And I think it also depended on the fit of your corset. I think there could be, poorly fitting or poorly made corsets that would bother you. One thing we see, it's kind of an interesting note, is in corset covers, and which is a layer, and it's kind of an optional layer, but you see wear on the back of like corset covers and bodices here, which show where like the knot, the lace of corsets has rubbed through a garment. So I can only imagine if it's rubbing through your outer garment, it might be like poking you in the back there too and causing some discomfort. But yeah, I think that, it's probably not unlike your favorite pair of jeans, if you've got that great pair of jeans that's broken in and it's comfortable to wear versus like the one that doesn't fit right but does the job and you just kind of put up with.
I think that's a great analogy. Laura wants to know, is the 17-inch waist a myth?
I don't know what the smallest recorded waist is. I did come across very interesting statistic that said in the 19th century, the average circumference of a woman's waist was 22 inches, which is very small because the average circumference of a modern American woman's waist now is somewhere in the 32 to 34 inches range. So we've gained another 10 to 12 inches. However, as recently as the 1950s, the average American's woman's waist was 24 to 25 inches. So and if we're talking a corset reduces the span of your waist by 2 inches and you've got a 22-inch waist, that's still really pretty small.
Cynthia asks, what was the influence of publications such as Godey's Ladies Book?
That's a great question. So in the 19th century, fashion originates in Paris, basically. So Parisian fashion plates are kind of the source of what's new. They're what people look to for styles. So these tend to make their way to the United States, where they are immediately grabbed and copied by your Godey's, your Petersons, your American publications that are just, basically they hire artists and they're just directly ripping off the Parisian fashions. And then these are mass distributed into women's homes. Those Godey's magazines were highly accessible. You find them in rural locations, urban locations. They don't come with patterns or directions until the 1860s or 1870s. So initially, all you have is a picture, and then you take that, and it's presuming, you know, your own sewing skills, or that you have a dressmaker that you work with, and you and your dressmaker work together, like, okay, you know, this is the look, how can we achieve it? And often it's a matter of saying like, oh, okay, we're wearing bows on our shoulders this season, so I'm going to take my old dress and I'm going to attach bows to the season, or I'm going to shoulders, or I'm going to, you know, change the fit of the cuffs. And it's seeing the trim and the minute alterations that you can look stylish rather than like making a whole dress. And also just kind of, you know, like fashion magazines today, the Godey's is the ideal, is the total picture, is all the bows and lace and ribbons. So you implement, you know, as much of that as you want, or as much as that as you can afford, but you're usually not like copying the entire fashion plate.
Wonderful, wonderful. So Erika, what advice would you give to someone interested in a wonderful career like your own?
Oh my gosh. Be passionate about it. Learn, visit museums, find out what you're interested in and read up on it, develop some expertise on it, and then share it. And there are so many platforms out there, you know, so just, you know, make a YouTube video, or contact your local library and see if they'd be interested in a talk, or contact your museum to see if they'd be willing to work together, if you can research objects and, you know, you can do something with it. Yeah, just follow your bliss, follow your passion.
Wonderful. We could talk for hours. You have such great information, and we so appreciate you being with us today. I want to thank our wonderful audience and the fabulous questions. Erika Holst, we can't wait to see what you do next. What a wonderful presentation. And I just want, for the National Arts Club, I'm David Zyla. Thank you for joining us. And for more information about the National Arts Club and similar programs, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Thank you.
Thanks so much.